deep in the mist-shrouded forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the ancient cedars whisper secrets older than time itself, there lurks a figure cloaked in shadow, being feared and revered by the Kwakwakawakw people for generations. They call him Bakwas, the king of ghosts, a spectral ruler who dwells among the skeletal trees and rotting logs, waiting for the unwary to stumble into his realm. Picture this, a lone traveler, drawn by the eerie glow of ghostly fires flickering between the trees, only to find themselves face to face with emaciated spirits feasting on rotten food, a grotesque mockery of life, presided over by Bakwas himself. This isn't just a ghost story, it's a doorway into the rich, haunting mythology of the Kwakiutl people, where the boundary between the living and the dead is as thin as the morning fog. The Kwakwakawakw, often known as the Kwakiutl, have thrived along the rugged coasts and dense rainforests of what's now British Columbia for countless generations. Their world is one where spirits walk alongside humans, where masks and dances bring ancestral powers to life, and where stories like Bakwas's aren't just tales, they're lessons, warnings, and sacred truths wrapped in the chilling embrace of the supernatural. Bakwas isn't merely a boogeyman, he's a reflection of the Kwakiutl's deep connection to the unseen forces that shape their world. To understand him is to step into a tradition where every rustling leaf might carry a message from the other side, where the dead are never truly gone, and where the line between myth and reality blurs into something far more profound. Why does Bakwas haunt the edges of the Kwakiutl imagination? What does his grotesque kingdom of decay reveal about their beliefs, and perhaps even our own fears of the unknown? Today, we're diving into the heart of this chilling legend, unraveling the mysteries of Bakwas's realm, his connection to the spirits of the drowned, and the eerie rituals that once kept him at bay. This isn't just a journey into folklore, it's an exploration of how a culture sees beyond the veil of death, turning terror into tradition. So steel yourself, because we're about to step into the world of Bakwas, where the dead don't rest, they feast. And by the end, you might just find yourself glancing over your shoulder, wondering if that sound in the darkness is the wind or something far worse. To truly grasp the haunting presence of Bakwas in Kwakwakawakw mythology, we must first walk among the towering cedars and misty shorelines that shaped his legend. The Kwakwakawakw people, whose name means those who speak Kwakwala, have called the rugged islands and coastal forests of British Columbia home for thousands of years. Their world is one where the ocean's roar mingles with the whispers of ancestors, where every inlet and mountain carries the weight of stories passed down through generations. Imagine a landscape so alive with spirit that the very trees seem to watch, a place where the supernatural isn't just believed in, but lived alongside. Central to their culture is the potlatch, a ceremonial feast that binds communities together through elaborate gift-giving, dancing, and storytelling. These gatherings aren't mere celebrations, they're sacred acts of renewal, where myths leap from the realm of memory into vivid, breathing life. Dancers don intricately carved masks that transform them into supernatural beings, channeling the power of ancestors and spirits. It's here, in the flickering firelight of the potlatch, that Bakwas's tale would unfold, a warning whispered to children, a lesson wrapped in bone-chilling imagery. The Kwakwakawakw understand that stories like his aren't just entertainment. They're the threads that weave the fabric of their identity, teaching respect for the unseen forces that govern their world. Their spiritual beliefs paint a universe brimming with beings that blur the line between the physical and the ethereal, Unlike European ghosts confined to cold, lonely graves, Bakwas and his ilk are deeply tied to the land, the damp rot of the forest floor, the eerie silence of abandoned villages, the tides that claim the drowned. He isn't just a random specter, he's a reflection of very real fears. In a culture sustained by fishing and foraging, the threat of starvation or drowning was never far away. Bakwas embodies these dangers, his rotting offerings a grotesque parody of sustenance, his realm a dark mirror of the Kwakwakawakwa's dependence on nature's bounty. What makes their mythology so gripping is its immediacy. These aren't distant gods on mountaintops, but entities lurking in the next bay, the next copse of trees. When the Kwakwakawakw speak of Bakwas, they're not spinning idle tales, they're acknowledging the ever-present tension between survival and the unseen, between the living and those who have slipped beneath the waves. His legend persists not just to frighten, but to remind. The boundary between worlds is fragile, and not all who beckon from the shadows mean you well. Bakwas rules over a kingdom unseen by mortal eyes, a spectral domain where the dead who met watery graves or perished in the forests embrace wander as emaciated shadows. Known as the King of Ghosts, his presence lingers in the liminal spaces, the tide-washed beaches where driftwood piles like bones, the hollowed-out cedar stumps where mist coils like breath, the abandoned villages where silence hangs thicker than fog. To the Kwakwakawakw, he isn't merely a ghost, he's a sovereign of loss, a collector of souls who failed to find their way to the afterlife. His title carries weight, for where European folklore might speak of phantom kings in crumbling castles, Bakwas holds court among the rotting and the ruined, his crown woven from kelp and his throne built from storm-tossed logs. Witnesses describe him as gaunt, his sunken eyes glowing with a sickly light, his fingers like gnarled roots reaching for the living. He's often seen surrounded by his subjects, spirits so withered they appear as skeletal echoes of their former selves, forever chewing on the illusion of food, maggot-ridden fish, clumps of moss, shellfish long drained of life. These grotesque feasts are more than macabre theater, they're a warning. In Kwakiutl belief, the dead must be guided to the spirit world through proper rituals, or risk becoming trapped in Bakwas's realm, doomed to crave sustenance that will never nourish. His kingdom thrives on neglect, on the unspoken fear that the rituals of remembrance might falter, leaving the dead to hunger eternally. Yet Bakwas isn't a mindless predator. There's a twisted duality to his role, a reverence tangled with terror. Elders speak of him with cautious respect, for he embodies a sacred truth. The dead are never truly gone, and the boundary between worlds demands acknowledgement. When fishermen vanish in sudden squalls or hunters disappear into the forest's depths, Bakwas becomes both culprit and custodian. He takes, but he also reminds. His presence enforces a cultural contract: honor the departed, or risk joining his mournful feast. This is why parents warn children not to wander near the shore at dusk, why offerings are left at the base of weathered totem poles, not just out of fear, but from an understanding that even the darkest spirits have their place in the balance of things. The forests where Bakwas lurks aren't just settings for his legend, they're active participants. Kwakwakawakw cosmology sees the land as alive with spirit, every rustling branch or echoing bird call potentially a message. Bakwas's territory overlaps with the unseen villages of the dead, places where the veil between worlds thins. To stumble upon one of his ghostly gatherings isn't merely bad luck, it's a trespass into a space where the rules of the living no longer apply. Survivors of such encounters, or those who claim to be, tell of hearing laughter like cracking ice, of feeling the chill of hands that aren't there, of waking miles from where they last remember standing. their clothes damp with seawater they never touched. These stories aren't just chilling campfire tales. They're maps of the Kwakwakawakwa's spiritual landscape, where Bakwas serves as both menace and mirror, reflecting the consequences of forgetting. What makes him uniquely terrifying isn't just his appearance or his dominion, it's his persistence. Unlike transient phantoms, Bakwas endures, woven into the fabric of Kwakwakawakwa life through art, ceremony, and whispered caution. Masked dancers might channel him during potlatches, their carved visages contorted in eternal hunger, reminding the community of the stakes. In a culture where memory is a lifeline to the past and a bridge to the future, Bakwas is the shadow that ensures no one crosses that bridge unprepared. He's the reason an elder might pause to toss a handful of dried salmon into the surf before a journey, the reason children are taught to listen for voices in the waves. Because in the end, Bakwas isn't just the king of ghosts, he's the keeper of a truth as old as the tides. Some hungers, once awakened, can never be filled. Bakwas didn't simply emerge from the fog. One day, his origins are etched into the very fabric of Kwakwakawakw cosmology, a tapestry woven with creation myths and the intricate relationships between spirits. To understand how he became the king of ghosts, we must journey back to the time when the world was still soft, when the boundaries between the human and spirit realms were barely formed. Among the Kwakwakawakw, creation stories often center around the transformative power of ancestral beings, and Bakwas is no exception. Some elders speak of him as a fallen figure, once a mortal who strayed too far into the domain of the spirits and was cursed to rule over those who, like him, had lost their way. Others whisper that he was never human at all, that he was born from the first breath of a drowned man, a primal force shaped by the ocean's hunger and the forest's whispers. One particularly haunting version of his origin ties him to the myth of the first potlatch, a ceremony meant to honor both the living and the dead. In this telling, Bakwas was once a powerful chief who, in his greed, hoarded the gifts meant for the spirits, refusing to share even with his own ancestors. As punishment, the supernatural beings dragged him beneath the waves, transforming him into a hollow-eyed warden of the forgotten. Now, his cursed kingdom mirrors his sin, never-ending feast where the food rots before it can be eaten, where the dead gnaw on emptiness just as he once clung to wealth. This isn't just morality tale, it's a cornerstone of Kwakwakawakw values, reinforcing the sacred duty to honor the dead through generosity and ritual. But Bakwas doesn't rule alone. His realm intersects with other key figures in Kwakiutl mythology, like Kwakwakawakw, the great spirit who judges the dead, or Tsanakwa, the wild woman of the woods who steals children. Some stories even suggest Bakwas and Tsanakwa are locked in an eternal struggle, she, the devourer of the lost, and he, the collector of the drowned. Their dynamic reveals a broader spiritual hierarchy, where spirits specialize in different kinds of loss, each a reminder of the consequences of neglecting tradition. Bakwas's connection to these beings isn't just about power, it's about balance. He exists as part of an ecosystem of spirits, each one a thread in the web that holds the Kwakwakawakw world together. What makes his origin so compelling is how deeply it's rooted in the natural world. The Kwakwakawakw didn't imagine their spirits in distant heavens or abstract realms. They saw them in the driftwood that resembled bones, in the way the tide pulled at the shore like grasping hands. Bakwas's story breathes with the rhythms of the coast, the fear of shipwrecks, the dread of starvation, the respect owed to the ocean that gives and takes life. He isn't just a lesson in morality, he's a personification of the environment itself, a reminder that the land and sea have their own laws, their own voices. When elders speak of him, they're not just recounting a myth, they're teaching how to listen to the world. Perhaps that's why his legend endures. Bakwas isn't a static character frozen in ancient tales. He evolves with the people, adapting to new fears while retaining his core role. Even today, when modern Kwakwakawakw artists carve his likeness into masks or recount his stories, they're not preserving a relic, they're keeping alive a conversation with the unseen, a dialogue as vital now as it was centuries ago. Because in the end, Bakwas's origin isn't just about how he came to be. It's about how we, the living, remember to walk the line between worlds without slipping into the dark. Bakwas's physical form is a nightmare given flesh, or rather, the absence of it. Witnesses describe him as a skeletal figure draped in tattered remnants of what might have once been regalia, his body so emaciated that the hollows between his ribs cast shadows even in the dimmest light. His skin clings to his bones like damp bark peeling from a dead tree, the color of moldering seaweed left too long in the sun. But it's his eyes that freeze the blood, two smoldering pits of sickly green or ghostly blue, glowing like bioluminescent waves crashing on a moonless night. They don't just see you, they reflect the depths of his kingdom, flickering with the same eerie light that lures lost souls to his feasts. His hands are another horror, elongated fingers ending in cracked, blackened nails, more like the talons of a scavenger bird than anything human. When he moves, it's with the unnatural grace of something that hasn't needed breath for centuries, his joints bending in ways that suggest bones held together by will alone. Some accounts claim his mouth is sewn shut with sinew or kelp, forcing him to communicate in wet, guttural whispers that echo as if rising from the ocean floor. Others say his lips are perpetually parted, revealing jagged teeth stained with the residue of his rotten offerings, a permanent grimace etched by eternal hunger. Every aspect of his appearance drips with symbolism. The skeletal frame isn't just for fright, it embodies the Kwakwakawakwa's intimate relationship with decay as a transformative force. In their world, rotting logs birth new growth, and the ocean's tides redistribute life through death. Bakwas mirrors this cycle, but twisted. Where nature renews, he stagnates. His emaciation represents not just starvation, but spiritual depletion, the consequence of failing to nourish the dead with remembrance. Even his glowing eyes carry meaning. In Kwakiutl art, light often signifies supernatural vision, the ability to perceive what lies beyond the veil. Bakwas's gaze doesn't just pierce the dark, it bridges worlds, a beacon for souls trapped in the in-between. Then there's his attire, what remains of it. Tattered fragments of ceremonial robes cling to his frame, suggesting a ruler's status reduced to parody. The fabric, if it can be called that, resembles waterlogged burial shrouds or the frayed edges of fishing nets dragged ashore after years adrift. This decaying finery speaks volumes about his domain, a kingdom built on what's been discarded, a throne room of flotsam and forgotten things. It's a chilling metaphor for how easily tradition can unravel when neglected, how even the most sacred rites can wither into hollow gestures if not tended. Perhaps most telling is the food he offers: the maggot-ridden fish, the clumps of soggy moss, the shellfish reduced to brittle husks. These aren't random horrors, they're distorted reflections of the Kwakwakawakwa's sustenance. The very resources that sustain the living: salmon, clams, berries, are perverted in Bakwas's hands, becoming taunts rather than nourishment. It's a visceral reminder that the line between survival and ruin is thin, and that the dead, if dishonored, can poison the living's connection to the land's bounty. Even his surroundings reinforce his symbolism. He's never depicted in vast, empty wilderness, but in places where human presence once lingered, abandoned village sites, storm-wrecked canoes half buried in sand, the skeletal remains of longhouses reclaimed by the forest. These aren't just settings, they're gravestones for memory. When Bakwas appears, he doesn't just haunt individuals, he haunts the idea of forgetting itself. His body is a living memento mori, a warning etched in bone and shadow. Neglect the past, and the past will feast on you. Bakwas's dominion is no ordinary afterlife. It's a liminal space carved from the Kwakwakawak's most primal fears and deepest spiritual truths. Picture a forest where the trees stand as jagged sentinels, their trunks slick with perpetual dampness, their roots twisting into shapes that resemble grasping hands. The air here hangs thick with the briny tang of the nearby sea, mingling with the earthy rot of decaying wood. This isn't just a setting, it's a living embodiment of transition, a place where the physical world frays at the edges, revealing the spectral realm beneath. The ground squelches underfoot as if the earth itself is half liquid, and the mist never lifts. It coils around ankles like the cold fingers of the drowned, obscuring paths that might lead back to the living. Those who have glimpsed Bakwas's realm in visions or near-death experiences speak of its duality. By day, if such a word applies where light never fully penetrates, it mirrors the Kwakwakawak's coastal homeland, but twisted. Familiar landmarks appear distorted, a bay where the water flows backward, a village of crumbling longhouses populated only by shadows that mimic the motions of the living. By night, the forest transforms. Bioluminescent fungi pulse like distant campfires, luring wanderers deeper into the gloom, while ghostly figures reenact their final moments in endless loops. Fishermen cast nets into phantom tides, hunters stalk prey that evaporates at the spear's touch, all under Bakwas's watchful gaze, but his kingdom isn't confined to the woods. Some traditions describe an underwater counterpart, a realm where the ocean floor opens into cavernous halls lined with the ribs of ancient whales. Here, the currents carry the whispers of those claimed by the sea, their voices woven into the crashing waves. This submerged domain reflects the Kwakwakawak's intimate ties to the ocean, their understanding that drowning isn't merely death, it's a surrender to a different kind of life. The drowned don't decay here, they drift in silent procession, their hair floating like kelp, their skeletal hands clutching relics of their former selves, a child's toy, a shattered paddle, a necklace of shells now home to blind, pale crabs. What makes this realm so unsettling isn't just its imagery, but its purpose. In many cultures, the afterlife is a place of rest or reward. Bakwas's domain serves as a cosmic crossroads, a holding ground for spirits who've been severed from proper rites. The Kwakwakawakw believe the dead must journey to the spirit world through ceremonies, songs, and the guidance of ancestors. Without these, souls linger in Bakwas's twilight, caught between worlds like smoke trapped under ice. His realm isn't hell, it's a cultural emergency room, a stark reminder of the living's duty to shepherd the departed home. The connection to Kwakiutl death practices runs deep. Mortuary rituals often involved placing bodies in bent cedar boxes high in the trees or in caves, elevated spaces that mirrored Bakwas's arboreal domain. These choices weren't arbitrary. They kept the dead close enough to watch over the living, but anchored in transition, preventing them from slipping into his hungry grasp. Even the act of naming carries weight. The Kwakwakawakw practice of naming children after deceased relatives isn't just about remembrance, it's a tether, ensuring the dead remain part of the community's fabric. their spirits nourished by the living's voices rather than cursed to crave Bakwas's rotten feasts. Yet there's a haunting ambiguity to his realm. While it's a place of stagnation, it's also one of potential. Some stories tell of souls who, through sheer will or the tardy intervention of a shaman, escape Bakwas's hold. These spirits don't return to life, but they don't stay trapped either. They transcend, becoming guides or protectors. This nuance reveals the Kwakwakawakwa's complex view of death, not an end, but a transformation with infinite variations. Bakwas's kingdom exists as a cautionary threshold, a testament to what happens when the living falter in their sacred duties, but also proof that even in the darkest corners of the spirit world, redemption flickers like a guttering candle. The realm's very geography whispers lessons. The twisted trees, they're the inverted counterparts of totem poles, their carvings eroded by time into grotesque parodies. The perpetual mist, it's the visual echo of breath stolen mid-sentence, life cut short before stories could be finished. Even the silence holds meaning where the living world thrums with bird calls and crashing waves. Bakwas's domain swallows sound, leaving only the wet crunch of teeth on inedible offerings. To step into this place is to step into the Kwakwakawakwa's collective unconscious, where every shadow is a story waiting to be remembered, every gust of wind a plea for proper burial. Modern Kwakwakawakwa artists still map this realm in carvings and paintings, not as superstition, but as cultural preservation. When a mask depicting Bakwas is danced at a potlatch, the wearer doesn't just play a monster, they channel a geography of loss, a warning etched in cedar and pigment. Because the true horror of Bakwas's kingdom isn't its ghosts or its rot. It's the thought that such a place could exist at all, that memory could fail so utterly. The forest may be shadowed, the water may be deep, but the greatest darkness lies in forgetting. The ghosts who serve under Bakwas are neither mindless shades nor one-dimensional monsters. They're a chorus of stories frozen in their final, desperate moments. Kwakwakawakwa tradition describes these spirits as shadowy, souls who died without the proper rites, their journeys to the afterlife interrupted by tragedy or neglect. Picture a fisherman swallowed by a sudden storm, his body never recovered, a child lost in the woods, her name whispered by the wind, warriors fallen in battles far from home, their bones left to the ravens. These aren't just the dead, they're the unfinished, tethered to Bakwas not by loyalty, but by the raw, aching need for resolution. Their existence in his realm is one of cruel irony. While the Kwakwakawakwa believe properly honored ancestors become guiding spirits, watching over their descendants with benevolent clarity, Bakwas's subjects are trapped in a grotesque parody of life. They shuffle through the mist, re-enching their deaths in endless loops, drowning in phantom tides, collapsing from hunger that never ends, calling out to loved ones who can't hear them. Yet there's a hierarchy even here. Elders speak of spirits who cling to fragments of their identity, their hollow eyes flickering with recognition when offerings are made in their names. Others have decayed into something less distinct, pale, wailing things that resemble humans only in the way a rotten log resembles a tree. The living Kwakwakawakwa engaged with these spirits in ways that might surprise outsiders. They didn't simply fear them, they negotiated. Shoreline villages left small gifts at the tide line: dried salmon, beads, bits of copper, not just to appease Bakwas, but to nourish the specific ghosts believed to linger there. A family who lost someone at sea might whisper their name into a clamshell before casting it into the waves, a fragile message in a liquid bottle. These acts weren't superstition, they were maintenance, a way of stitching the frayed edges between worlds. Because the greatest horror wasn't a ghost's wrath, it was their sorrow. A neglected spirit might grow desperate enough to follow the scent of living breath back to the village, not to harm, but to plead. Stories tell of faint knocks at longhouse doors, of footprints appearing in the ash of cold hearths, all silent cries for the rituals that would finally set them free. Yet some spirits under Bakwas's command were met with deliberate avoidance. Places where violence or madness had occurred, a cove where a massacre unfolded, a stretch of forest stained by suicide, were marked with woven branches or overturned stones, visual warnings to steer clear. The Kwakwakawakw understood that not all ghosts could be reasoned with. Those who died consumed by rage or sorrow sometimes carried that energy into the afterlife, their presence like a wound in the world. Shamans, armed with cedar branch whisks and ancestral songs, would occasionally venture into these spaces to cool the spirits, not with confrontation, but with acknowledgement, singing their names until the air itself seemed to exhale. The most chilling encounters, though, were the accidental ones. Hunters who strayed too far into the fog might stumble upon a clearing where the trees grew unnaturally straight, their branches forming a skeletal canopy overhead. There, they'd see the feast back was presiding over a table of driftwood, surrounded by gaunt figures gnawing on rocks disguised as clams, seaweed that turned to dust in their fingers. The living interloper would be invited, not with words, but with a slow, synchronized turning of spectral heads. To eat at that table was to be claimed, but to refuse risked provoking something worse. Survival depended on a razor's edge of etiquette, accepting the offering without consuming it, speaking the right words of thanks without making promises, backing away without turning one's back. These weren't just ghost stories, they were survival manuals, teaching how to navigate a world where the dead were always listening. What emerges from these traditions is a profound empathy. The Kwakwakawakw didn't view Bakwas or his subjects as mere villains, but as tragic figures enmeshed in a system larger than themselves. Their rituals weren't about domination, but balance, a way of tending the delicate web connecting all states of existence. Even the act of avoidance carried respect, an understanding that some wounds, spiritual or otherwise, needed time and space to heal. When a dancer donned a Bakwas mask during a potlatch, the performance wasn't just a scare tactic. It was an act of remembrance, a way of saying, "We see you. We haven't forgotten," because in the end, the greatest fear wasn't the dead, it was the thought of becoming like them, untethered, unmoored, a story no one bothered to tell anymore. Among the Kwakwakawakw, stories of Bakwas encounters aren't just spine-tingling tales, they're survival lessons etched in shadow. Take the account of a fisherman named Galanis, who one evening spotted strange lights bobbing near the shore. Thinking it might be fellow villagers gathering shellfish, he paddled closer, only to see the glow came from spectral fires, their flames burning blue-green without heat. Around them crouched figures with sunken cheeks, shoving handfuls of rotted kelp into their mouths. At their center sat Bakwas, his skeletal fingers extending a decimated salmon toward Galanis, its flesh crawling with pale, wriggling things. The fisherman's gut screamed to flee, but politeness rooted him in place. To outright refuse a spirit's offer was unthinkable. Instead, he carefully accepted the gift, then let it slip into the water when Bakwas turned away, murmuring thanks for the generous offering. That split-second act of ritual respect spared his life, while others who'd mocked or fled became permanent guests at that cursed banquet. Not all encounters end with such delicate balance. In one harrowing legend, a young man named Tilekis taunted his elders about their childish ghost stories, carving Bakwas's likeness into a rotting log and kicking it into the sea. That night, the tides carried it back along with something else. Villagers found Til Ekis the next morning, his body curled around the same log, his mouth stuffed with barnacles and his eyes wide with terror. The unsettling detail: his stomach was bloated as if he'd feasted, yet autopsy revealed nothing inside but seawater and crushed shells. Here, Bakwas's vengeance wasn't just about punishment, it was a grotesque demonstration. The boy died not from violence, but from the very hunger he'd mocked, forced to gorge on what the dead endure eternally. Women feature prominently in these cautionary tales, often as voices of wisdom who navigate Bakwas's traps. A story from the Nimkish River tells of Ilanis, who woke to hear her drowned brother's voice calling from the shore. Where others might have rushed blindly, she paused. True Kwakwakawakw spirits never demand, only invite. Suspicious, she tossed a strand of her mother's hair beads toward the sound. When they hit the ground with a dull thud rather than the expected clatter, she knew it wasn't her brother, but Bakwas weaving illusion. Her restraint became legend, teaching that the dead return with quiet dignity, while hungry ghosts scream their need. Children's tales carry their own layered warnings. One widespread bedtime story describes a girl who followed a beautiful white bird into the woods, only to find it perched on Bakwas's shoulder, its song now the wails of lost souls. What saves her isn't strength, but memory. She recites her family lineage aloud, each name pushing Bakwas's grasping hands back like an unseen shield. The message is clear: identity, tradition, and belonging are the true safeguards against the king of ghosts. Modern encounters still surface in Kwakwakawakw communities, blending old fears with new contexts. A fisherman in the 1990s swore he saw a cluster of people feasting on a floating log near Alert Bay until his flashlight revealed their faces collapsing inward like rotten pumpkins. A group of teenagers camping near an old village site in 2012 reported hearing laughter from the water, then found their food supplies teeming with maggots despite being sealed. These stories aren't dismissed as hysteria. They're discussed at potlatches as living reminders that Bakwas doesn't fade, he adapts. What unites these accounts is their visceral teaching. Unlike Western ghost stories focused on shock, Bakwas encounters emphasize cause and effect. The terror lies not in random jump scares, but in the precise consequences of broken taboos, disrespect toward the dead, neglected rituals, arrogance toward tradition. Each tale is a map of spiritual cause and effect, showing exactly where the path of carelessness leads and how thin the barrier between our world and his truly is. To hear these stories is to understand that in Kwakwakawakw belief, ghosts aren't just what haunt us, they're what we create when we forget. Bakwas's reign over the hungry dead isn't the only dark thread woven through Kwakwakawakw spirituality. To truly understand his place in their cosmology, we must unravel his eerie kinship with the Hamatsa, the cannibal spirit, a figure both feared and revered in Kwakiutl ceremonial life. At first glance, they seem opposites. Bakwas, the gaunt ruler of withered ghosts; the Hamatsa, a ravenous entity embodied by dancers who gnash their teeth and foam at the mouth during potlatches. Yet peel back the layers, and you'll find these two spirits are twisted reflections of each other, two sides of the same copper ceremonial disc. The Hamatsa ritual, central to Kwakiutl winter ceremonies, sees initiates possessed by the spirit of Bakwas, a supernatural being whose name translates to the cannibal at the north end of the world. Dancers vanish into the forest, only to return wild-eyed, miming acts of consumption so violent they'd bite chunks from cedar bark or even their own flesh. The parallels to Bakwas's realm are uncanny. Both spirits govern cycles of unnatural hunger, where Bakwas's subjects starve on rotten feasts. The Hamatsa embodies insatiable craving. But here's the crucial distinction. The Hamatsa's frenzy is ultimately tamed by ceremony. Through song, dance, and the giving of gifts, the possessed are gradually civilized, their hunger redirected into communal strength. Bakwas, by contrast, represents what happens when such rituals fail, when hunger remains unchecked, festering in the shadows. Symbolically, their connection runs deeper. The Hamatsa's iconic cedar bark rings, worn around the neck, mirror the kelp strands Bakwas is said to drape over his skeletal shoulders. Both spirits are associated with the liminal spaces where society frays, the Hamatsa with the untamed wilderness beyond the village, Bakwas with the abandoned places where villages used to be. Even their visual depictions share haunting similarities. Masks of both entities feature elongated, gaping mouths, though the Hamatsas are rimmed with red to signify life's heat, while Bakwas's are stained the gray-blue of drowned flesh. But perhaps the most profound link lies in what they represent culturally. The Hamatsa dances aren't merely performances, they're exorcisms of chaos, a way for the community to confront the wildness within themselves and transform it into order. Bakwas serves as the dark counterpart to this, a warning of what happens when chaos wins. Elders speak of him as the uninvited guest at the potlatch, the shadow that lingers at the edge of the firelight. Where the Hamatsa's hunger is ritualized into artistry, Bakwas's hunger festers in neglect. This duality reflects the Kwakwakawakwa's nuanced understanding of balance. Their world isn't divided into simple good and evil, but into forces that must be acknowledged and harmonized. The Hamatsa reminds them that even the most primal urges can be harnessed. Bakwas illustrates the cost of forgetting that lesson. When dancers don the Hamatsa mask, they're not just channeling a spirit, they're reaffirming a pact with the unseen, a promise to keep feeding the fires of tradition so the darker hungers never gain the upper hand. Modern Kwakwakawakw artists often depict Bakwas and the Hamatsa in paired carvings, one polished and vibrant, the other weathered and hollow, a visual dialogue between controlled frenzy and uncontrolled decay. These pieces aren't just art, they're theological debates in cedar and paint, because in the end, both spirits ask the same haunting question: what do we do with the hungers that threaten to consume us? The Kwakiutl answer, woven through generations of dance and story, is as simple as it is profound. Name them, feed them wisely, and never let them feast alone. The Kwakwakawakw didn't simply fear Bakwas, they engaged with him through precise, generations-old rituals designed to walk the razor's edge between respect and protection. Picture this: under the flickering light of a cedar bark torch, a shaman scatters crushed shell money into the surf, each piece glinting like a tiny moon as it sinks into the dark water. This isn't just an offering, it's a transaction, a way of saying, take this, not us. The rituals to appease the king of ghosts weren't about worship, they were negotiations with the unseen, a delicate dance of reciprocity that kept the living and the dead in balance. Central to these practices were the Tisekame ceremonial feasts held specifically for the forgotten dead. Unlike the communal potlatch, these gatherings were quiet, intimate affairs. Families would prepare plates of smoked salmon, dried berries, and ulachin oil, then place them at the edge of the village or on isolated stretches of beach. The food was never eaten by the living, it was left to rot deliberately, a mirror of Bakwas's own grotesque banquets. But here's the twist: by offering decay on their own terms, the Kwakwakawakw transformed it from a threat into a shield. The message was clear: we fed them ourselves, so you need not claim more. Masks played a pivotal role in these rituals. Carved from yellow cedar and stained with ochre, Bakwas masks were not mere representations, they were conduits. During winter ceremonies, dancers wearing these hollow-eyed visages would stagger through the longhouse, their movements mimicking the erratic lurch of starving spirits. Onlookers would toss bits of food at their feet, not as tribute, but as distraction, a symbolic scattering of crumbs to lead ghosts away from the vulnerable. The masks themselves were often reversible, one side showing Bakwas in his full skeletal horror, the other depicting a more benevolent ancestor. This duality reflected the ritual's core purpose, to acknowledge darkness while reaffirming light. Water served as both barrier and bridge in these practices. Shamans would fill ceremonial bowls from specific tide pools where the oceans churn mixed fresh and salt water, creating a liquid metaphor for the boundary between worlds. They'd chant over these vessels, their breath fogging the surface, before pouring the water into cracks in the earth, way of sealing Bakwas's influence below. Fishermen carried small pouches of graveyard dirt tied to their canoes, believing the weight of the dead would anchor them against being dragged under. Even children wore amulets of a balone shell, polished thin as parchment, said to refract Bakwas's gaze like a prism scattering light. The most potent rituals, however, were those performed for the drowned. When a body couldn't be recovered, families would commission a kikwa, a spirit canoe carved from a single log no longer than a forearm. Into this tiny vessel, they'd place strands of the deceased's hair, nail clippings, or even tears collected in clamshells. Under cover of fog, they'd set it adrift at the spot where the person vanished, whispering, "Go home, not to him." The Kwakwakawakw understood that Bakwas's power grew from incompletion. These acts of symbolic closure starved his kingdom of new subjects. Modern Kwakwakawakw artists and elders continue these traditions, though adapted for contemporary life. Today's offerings might include store-bought tobacco or coins tucked into the roots of cedar trees, but the intent remains unchanged. At the annual Ghost Feast in Alert Bay, community members still gather to sing the names of the missing into the wind, their voices weaving a net of memory too strong for Bakwas to tear. Because ultimately, these rituals weren't about fear, they were about love. Every chant, every mask, every rotting offering was a way of saying, "You are remembered. You belong to us, not to the shadows." In a world where even ghosts could hunger, the Kwakwakawakw chose to feed them not with decay, but with remembrance. To witness Bakwas emerge from cedar and paint in Kwakiutl ceremonial masks is to stare directly into the abyss, but an abyss meticulously carved, every groove a calculated weapon of terror. Master carvers don't simply depict the king of ghosts, they channel him, transforming slabs of aromatic yellow cedar into frozen screams. The first thing that strikes you is the mouth, an impossibly wide maw stretching ear to ear, lined with jagged teeth carved from a balone shell that catch the firelight like wet bone. Unlike the flowing curves of other spirit masks, Bakwas's visage is angular, his cheekbones sharp enough to draw blood, his hollow eyes set deep beneath a forehead ridged like a rotting log. The overall effect isn't just frightening, it's wrong, violating the natural symmetry of human features in ways that trigger primal alarm bells. What makes these masks truly unsettling is their layered craftsmanship. From the front, Bakwas appears skeletal, his emaciation emphasized by streaks of blue-gray paint mimicking decomposing flesh. But tilt the mask slightly, and hidden pigments ignite phosphorescent greens and sickly yellows mixed from ochre and pulverized shellfish, glowing dimly as if lit from within. This isn't mere decoration, it's spiritual engineering. Dancers wearing these masks during winter ceremonies move with jerky, unnatural motions, causing the colors to shift and pulse like bioluminescent waves. Witnesses describe the illusion of the mask's depth changing one moment a flat carving, the next a living void swallowing the wearer's face whole. The materials themselves tell a story. Carvers select cedar trees struck by lightning or hollowed by rot, believing the wood already carries echoes of Bakwas's realm. Adornments dangle from the chin-twisted strands of kelp, clusters of tiny bones, often bird or fish vertebrae, and sometimes actual human hair donated by mourners. These aren't macabre flourishes, they're conduits. Each element corresponds to Bakwas's mythos. The kelp whispers of drowned sailors, the bones mirror his skeletal court, the hair serves as both warning and tether, proof that the living still hold claim over the dead. Modern Kwakwakawakw artists like Bo Dick and David Knox have elevated this tradition while honoring its roots. Dick's Bakwas masks, now housed in museums worldwide, incorporate copper plates around the eyes, a nod to the metal's sacred status in Kwakiutl culture, believed to repel evil spirits. The copper doesn't shine, it's deliberately tarnished to a corpse-green patina, its surface etched with microscopic waves mimicking the ghost tides that carry souls to Bakwas. Contemporary carvers also play with scale, creating masks too large for human wearers, some spanning 3 feet across, meant to loom over potlatch gatherings like physical manifestations of collective dread. The transformative power of these masks reaches its peak during the Hamatsa dances. When a dancer dons Bakwas's likeness, they don't merely portray him, they undergo a ritual death. Elders speak of performers losing consciousness mid-dance, their bodies continuing to move with eerie precision as if puppeteered by unseen hands. The mask's interior is often lined with thorny devil's club stems, ensuring the wearer's pain keeps them teetering between worlds. This isn't theater, it's alchemy. By embodying Bakwas temporarily, the dancer enacts a cultural exorcism, drawing the ghost king's hunger into the open where it can be confronted, contained, and ultimately neutralized by the community's songs and offerings. Perhaps most striking is how these carvings balance horror and humanity. Even in his most terrifying depictions, Bakwas's masks often include subtle touches of tragedy, a single tear carved near one eye, a broken copper ring hanging lopsided from the nose. These details whisper that the king of ghosts wasn't always a monster, that his curse carries the weight of sorrow. When a dancer removes the mask at ceremony's end, they traditionally stroke its forehead in a gesture of pity before wrapping it in cedar bark, an act that transforms terror into something far more complex: remembrance, understanding, and the quiet promise that no one, not even the hungriest spirit, is beyond the reach of compassion. Bakwas isn't just a monster lurking in the shadows, he's a mirror held up to the deepest anxieties of the Kwakwakawakw people, a living metaphor carved from their collective dread. His stories do more than send chills down the spine. They etch vital lessons into the psyche of a culture intimately acquainted with life's fragility. Picture a society where survival hinges on the ocean's whim, where storms can swallow entire canoes in an instant, where the line between a bountiful harvest and starvation is as thin as morning mist. In such a world, Bakwas becomes the embodiment of every unspoken fear, the gnawing hunger of winter, the silent creep of decay, the terror of vanishing without a trace. His grotesque feasts aren't just nightmarish imagery, They're visceral reminders of what happens when communities fracture, when the bonds of memory and ritual fray. At its core, Bakwas represents the ultimate taboo, neglect, in Kwakwakawakw society, where oral traditions and potlatches weave the living and dead into a single tapestry. Forgetting is a sin worse than theft. To abandon ancestral rites, to leave a name unspoken, to let the stories fade, these aren't just oversights, they're spiritual catastrophes. Bakwas thrives in these gaps, his kingdom swelling with those who slipped through the cracks of remembrance. Parents didn't invoke his name merely to frighten children into obedience. They were teaching them the weight of their cultural responsibility. Every tale of a wanderer lured by ghostly fires was a lesson in vigilance. Every description of his skeletal court underscored the price of failing to honor the dead. Yet there's a paradoxical comfort in his horror. By personifying death and decay, the Kwakwakawakw gave shape to the formless, a way to confront the unthinkable on their own terms. European folklore often paints death as a hooded reaper, cold and impersonal. Bakwas is different. His hunger is specific, his rules clear. He doesn't strike randomly, he punishes those who break sacred contracts. This distinction transforms him from an indiscriminate predator into a dark enforcer of cultural order. His very existence reassures, follow the rituals and you're shielded. Forget them, and the consequences are as predictable as the tide. The psychological brilliance of Bakwas lies in his duality. He's both warning and catharsis. During potlatches, when masked dancers channeled his gaunt visage, the community didn't just witness a performance, they participated in collective therapy. The terror he inspired was deliberate, a controlled burn to purge deeper fears. By laughing at the dancers' exaggerated lurch or gasping as they mimed devouring rotten food, the Kwakwakawakw externalized their anxieties, rendering them tangible and therefore manageable. This wasn't escapism, it was emotional alchemy, turning the leaden weight of mortal dread into something shared, something survivable. Modern psychology might frame Bakwas as a cultural coping mechanism, but to reduce him to that would miss the point. He wasn't invented to explain misfortune. He was woven into the fabric of daily life as a constant negotiator between order and chaos. Fishermen whispering prayers before launching their canoes weren't just fearing him. They were acknowledging life's precarious balance. When elders recounted his tales, their voices didn't tremble with mindless terror, but with the measured respect of those who understand darkness intimately. Bakwas wasn't their enemy, he was the shadow that made the firelight brighter, the silence that gave songs their meaning. Today, as Kwakwakawakw artists carve his likeness into masks and storytellers revive his legends for new generations, Bakwas endures not as a relic of superstition, but as a testament to the power of narrative to shape resilience. His stories don't just scare, they scaffold. In a world still fraught with uncertainty, he remains a dark guardian of memory, whispering across centuries the same urgent truth: to remember is to resist the void. And in that resistance, even the hungriest ghosts can be kept at bay. Across the vast tapestry of Native American mythology, spirits of hunger and decay echo through countless traditions, but none quite mirror the eerie specificity of Bakwas. Take the Algonquin Wendigo, for instance, a gaunt, ice-hearted beast born from starvation and cannibalism. At first glance, they seem kin, both emaciated, both rulers of unnatural hunger. Yet where Bakwas presides over the sorrow of the forgotten dead, the Wendigo embodies the horror of becoming the monster. It's not just a spirit, it's a contagious curse, twisting the starving into predators who crave human flesh. The Wendigo's hunger is active, violent, a blizzard given teeth. Bakwas's feast, by contrast, is a passive torment, a cycle of eternal want without satiation. One represents the sin of consumption, the other, the tragedy of neglect. Then there are the Navajo skinwalkers, shapeshifters who wear the pelts of wolves or coyotes to stalk the living. Like Bakwas, they lurk at the edges of human settlement, thriving in the liminal spaces between worlds, but their power comes from malevolent magic, not the collective grief of the unremembered. Skinwalkers are wielders of curses, their existence tied to human choice, those who choose dark rites for personal gain. Bakwas doesn't choose, he is. His kingdom grows organically from cultural amnesia, a spectral consequence rather than a deliberate evil. Where skinwalkers inspire terror through active menace, Bakwas unsettles through absence, the creeping dread of what happens when memory fails. The ghost dance traditions of the Plains tribes offer another striking contrast. While Bakwas gathers souls trapped by neglected rituals, the spirits invoked in ghost dance ceremonies are active allies, returning to herald renewal and resistance. Both traditions acknowledge the dead's proximity to the living, but where one is a warning, the other is a rallying cry. Even their visual symbolism diverges. Bakwas's skeletal form speaks of decay, while ghost dance visions shimmer with ancestors clad in vibrant regalia, their presence a promise rather than a threat. Yet perhaps the most revealing comparison lies with the Tlingit Kashtaka, the land otter men who mimic human voices to lure victims into the wilderness. Like Bakwas, they prey on the vulnerable, the lost, the lonely. Both twist the familiar into something uncanny. Bakwas's rotting feasts parody human sustenance, while the Kashtaka's mimicry perverts human connection. But the Kashtaka are tricksters, their malice playful. Bakwas doesn't deceive, he reveals. His horror isn't in disguise, but in stark, unavoidable truth, the consequence of breaking sacred bonds with the departed. What unites these entities across cultures isn't just their frightful imagery, but their role as guardians of cultural boundaries. The Wendigo punishes taboo acts of consumption. The Skinwalker embodies the dangers of forbidden knowledge. Bakwas, meanwhile, stands as a sentinel against forgetting. Each reflects the unique ecological and social pressures of their people. The Wendigo, born from the Algonquins' harsh winters, the Skinwalker rooted in Navajo clanship complexities, Bakwas shaped by the Kwakwakawakwa's reliance on oral tradition and maritime peril. They're not interchangeable monsters, but mirrors distorted, yes, but revealing the contours of the societies that birthed them. Modern retellings often blur these distinctions, reducing indigenous spirits to generic boogeymen. But to conflate Bakwas with the Wendigo or Skinwalkers is to miss the profound cultural nuance each carries. The Wendigo is a cautionary tale about the monster within. The Skinwalker is a parable of power's corruption. Bakwas, he's a lament, a reminder that the dead don't fade quietly, and that some hungers can only be fed by remembering. Bakwas never fully retreated into the realm of forgotten myth. His hollow eyes still peer out from modern Kwakwakawakw art. His stories whispered in classrooms and carved into cedar with the same reverence as centuries past. Walk through the Umista Cultural Center in Alert Bay today, and you'll find his skeletal grin leering from contemporary masks. Their surfaces not just painted but laser-etched with wave patterns that seem to shift when viewed from different angles. Artists like Bo Dick and Sean Hunt have reimagined him for new generations, blending traditional forms with startling modern twists. One mask features Bakwas's face emerging from a tangle of copper wiring, symbolizing how digital age distractions might fray ancestral memory. These aren't relics behind glass, they're living conversations, their creators often speaking of Bakwas not as folklore, but as a spiritual barometer measuring how well society maintains its pact with the past. The stories themselves have evolved without losing their teeth. Elder Bill Cranmer recounts Bakwas tales to schoolchildren during winter storytelling sessions, but now they carry new layers, warnings about climate change's impact on burial sites, metaphors for the cultural erosion caused by residential schools. When a dancer in a Bakwas mask stumbles through a potlatch today, the performance might incorporate elements echoing modern anxieties, cell phones that crackle with static from the spirit world, or fishing nets filled with plastic instead of salmon. Even the language shifts subtly, where elders once spoke of Bakwas claiming those forgotten by their kin, younger storytellers might add or stolen from them, acknowledging how colonial violence severed countless threads of remembrance. Yet perhaps the most striking adaptation lies in how Bakwas has become an unexpected emblem of resilience. During the potlatch ban from 1884 to 1951, when ceremonies were outlawed and masks confiscated, the Kwakwakawakw didn't abandon their stories. They encoded them. Children's dolls wore miniature Bakwas faces hidden under innocuous clothing. Picnics in the woods became covert storytelling sessions. Today, that history fuels a quiet revolution. At the annual Tisezala festival, teenagers perform slam poetry through Bakwas masks, their verses weaving residential school trauma with the Ghost King's hunger. The message is clear: just as Bakwas fed on neglect, so too does historical erasure. Digital spaces now echo with his presence. Kwakwakawakw TikTok creators animate his feasts using motion capture technology, the rotting food rendered in chilling detail. Podcasters like Ghosts in the Cedar dissect his symbolism in episodes that trend alongside true crime stories, proof that his brand of horror still captivates. Even video games get involved. Never Alone, developed with Inupiat collaborators, inspired a Kwakwakawakw-designed prototype where players navigate Bakwas's forest by listening for drowned spirits' whispers. These adaptations aren't diluting tradition, they're proving its elasticity. The deepest testament to Bakwas's endurance, though, lies in quieter places. Visit homes in Kinkum Inlet, and you might spot his likeness carved into cribbage boards or etched onto skateboard decks. High school drama club stage plays where he confronts opioid addiction, his rotting offerings replaced by pill bottles. Every rendering, every retelling reinforces the same truth. Bakwas was never just about the past. He's the embodiment of what happens when memory falters, and for the Kwakwakawakw, remembering isn't merely an act of preservation. It's defiance. So long as artists carve his face and children startle at his name, the pact remains unbroken. The dead are still fed, and the king of ghosts must keep waiting. When European settlers arrived on the shores of Kwakwakawakw territory, they brought more than muskets and missionaries. They carried an entire cosmology that would collide with Bakwas's ancient lore. Colonial authorities viewed indigenous spirit narratives as dangerous superstitions, and by the late 19th century, potlatches, the ceremonies where Bakwas's stories were danced into life, were outlawed. Imagine the rupture: generations of knowledge suppressed, masks confiscated or burned, elders punished for whispering Bakwas's name. Yet rather than vanishing, the king of ghosts did what spirits do best. He adapted, his stories slipping into the cracks between cultures like mist through cedars. Some missionaries, intent on eradicating pagan beliefs, inadvertently reshaped Bakwas's mythos through forced comparisons. Eager to frame indigenous spirituality as devil worship, they labeled him a demon of the forest, drawing parallels to Christian depictions of Satan. But the Kwakwakawakw noticed the flaws in this equation where Satan tempted souls toward eternal damnation. Bakwas didn't deceive. His hunger wasn't punishment for sin, but the consequence of neglect. Over time, a chilling syncretism emerged. In some communities, Bakwas began appearing in carvings with goat-like horns, a detail never present in pre-contact art. Yet these additions weren't mere mimicry, they became a subversive commentary. A mask from the early 20th century, now housed in the Canadian Museum of History, shows Bakwas with horns made of broken fishing hooks, a silent protest against colonization's ecological and spiritual disruptions. Even the language around was shifted under European influence. English translations often reduced him to a bogeyman, flattening his complex role as a custodian of memory. Christian funeral rites began mingling with traditional Kwakwakawakw death practices, creating hybrid rituals. Families who once left offerings for Bakwas's subjects started placing crosses at drowning sites, blending the old duty to the dead with new symbols. Yet in quiet acts of resistance, elders wove Bakwas into Christian frameworks, comparing him to the hungry ghosts referenced in biblical passages, or slyly suggesting his feasts mirrored the Last Supper's inversion. The most profound changes came through storytelling itself. Confined to secrecy, Bakwas narratives took on coded layers. A tale recorded in the 1930s describes him wearing a black robe eerily reminiscent of a priest's cassock, luring children not with rotten food, but with promises of schooling. Listen closely, and the subtext screams. This wasn't just a ghost story, it was an allegory for residential schools' cultural erasure. Other accounts from this era depict Bakwas stealing names instead of bodies, a poignant metaphor for how colonial policies severed indigenous identity. Today, scholars pore over these hybridized myths, recognizing them not as corrupted traditions, but as evidence of resilience. The Kwakwakawakw didn't abandon Bakwas, they armored him with new symbolism, letting him haunt the intersections of two worlds. Modern artists like Marian Nicholson even recontextualize him in installations pairing Project, Raven Surveillance, documents with archival mask photos, proof that the King of Ghosts still feasts on the neglected, whether they're forgotten ancestors or overlooked truths. His evolution isn't a dilution of tradition, but a testament to its enduring power, a spirit who refused to be buried, even when the world tried to erase him. Though Bakwas remains deeply rooted in Kwakwakawakw tradition, whispers of his legend have begun creeping into mainstream media, though not without complications. Unlike the Wendigo, which has been widely and often inaccurately adapted in horror films and video games, Bakwas's presence in popular culture is more subtle, a shadow flickering at the edges of recognition. One of the earliest appearances outside indigenous storytelling was in the 1970s anthology Spirits of the Coastal Forests, where a non-native author reimagined him as a generic forest wraith. The depiction sparked controversy for stripping away cultural context, reducing Bakwas to a stock boogeyman. Yet this misstep opened conversations about who gets to tell these stories and how. More respectful portrayals emerged in recent decades. The Canadian horror comic Skinwalkers, Wendigos, and other hungers devoted an entire issue to Bakwas, collaborating with Kwakwakawakw artist Joe Wilson to ensure authenticity. Here, he wasn't a mindless monster but a tragic figure, his backstory woven with real Kwakiutl burial practices. The comic's climax featured a modern-day archaeologist lured by ghostly lights, only to realize too late that the relics she'd stolen were anchors holding Bakwas's subjects to their rest. The twist, her own ancestors' bones were among them, a stark commentary on colonialism's cyclical harm. Video games have flirted with Bakwas-inspired elements, though rarely naming him directly. The survival horror game Until Dawn included a Wendigo subplot, but keen-eyed players noticed eerie similarities in one level, a misty beach where skeletal figures offered rotten fish to the protagonist. Designers later confirmed they'd drawn loose inspiration from Kwakwakawakw lore, though they avoided direct appropriation by blending motifs. More faithful representation came in Never Alone, Folktales, an expansion to the acclaimed Inupiat game, where a DLC Easter egg featured a hidden Bakwas mask in a shipwreck. Touching it triggered audio of distorted Kwakwala chants, a nod to the legend's maritime ties. Television's treatment has been mixed. A supernatural episode titled Hungry Ghosts borrowed Bakwas's feast imagery but transplanted it to a generic urban haunting, drawing criticism from indigenous viewers. In contrast, the CBC series Trickster wove Kwakwakawakw beliefs organically into its narrative, with Bakwas's influence lingering in the protagonist's visions of decay. The most groundbreaking portrayal came in the animated anthology Mythic Journeys, where Kwakwakawakw storyteller Gwali Edenshaw narrated Bakwas's tale over stunning visuals of a mask transforming from wood to living bone. Literature offers the richest explorations. Eden Robinson's Son of a Trickster trilogy references Bakwas indirectly through decaying food visions, a metaphor for generational trauma. Meanwhile, young adult author David A. Robertson collaborated with Kwakwakawakw elders for The Ghost Collector, where Bakwas appears as a misunderstood guide, not a villain, but a reluctant ferryman for lost souls. The most innovative reinterpretation might be in poet Joy Harjo's conflict resolution for Holy Beings, where Bakwas's feast becomes a metaphor for America's unresolved history. We keep setting the table with apologies no one eats. What's striking is how these adaptations, both flawed and respectful, reflect broader tensions. When Bakwas appears authentically, he's often a vehicle for discussing cultural erasure or environmental destruction. When mishandled, he becomes another exoticized horror trope. Yet even missteps have value. They highlight the hunger for indigenous stories in mainstream spaces and the responsibility that comes with sharing them. Perhaps that's why modern Kwakwakawakw creators like Sean Hunt embrace pop culture references in their Bakwas carvings. One mask sports a tiny Blair Witch-style stick figure in its maw, a wry commentary on who really owns the woods. As audiences increasingly demand authentic representation, Bakwas's media presence may evolve beyond cameos. Rumors swirl of a Kwakwakawakw-led horror film in development, where he'd star not as a monster, but as a dark mirror to residential school trauma. Whether that happens or not, his slow seep into popular culture proves one thing: the King of Ghosts refuses to stay confined to the past. Every adaptation, every imperfect retelling, is another flickering campfire where his story, and the people who birthed it, won't be forgotten. Among the Kwakwakawakw, shamans weren't just healers or mystics, they were the living bridges between Bakwas's realm and the world of the living, trained from childhood to navigate the treacherous currents of the spirit world. Picture a dimly lit longhouse, the air thick with the scent of crushed cedar and eulachon oil as a shaman, draped in a cloak of woven mountain goat wool, begins to chant. The rhythm isn't random, it mimics the lapping of waves against a canoe, a sonic map to guide their soul's journey. These shamans, known as Piaksala, didn't fight back was directly. They negotiated, bargained, and sometimes outwitted him through rituals honed over generations. Central to their practice was the Hamatsa initiation, where apprentices would vanish into the wilderness for days, fasting until visions blurred the line between flesh and spirit. Elders speak of trainees returning with their lips stained blue from chewing devil's club stems, their pupils dilated from staring into Bakwas's domain without blinking. The most harrowing test involved lying motionless in a burial trench overnight, allowing the shaman to feel the weight of the earth pressing down like the grip of hungry ghosts. Only those who could endure this symbolic death and return whispering the names of the forgotten dead earned the right to wear the Dizunakwa mask, marking them as mediators between worlds. Protection rituals often revolved around spirit traps, intricate contraptions of cedar bark and a balone shell placed near village boundaries. These weren't physical barriers, but psychic ones. A shaman might weave a net of human hair donated by mourners and hang it from a tree, chanting until the strands quivered with invisible energy. The theory was simple. Bakwas's subjects, drawn by the scent of the living, would become entangled in this web of memory, their hunger momentarily sated by the essence of those who still remembered them. Some traps incorporated mirrors, not glass, but polished copper sheets designed to reflect a spirit's own emptiness back at them, startling them into retreat. Trances played a pivotal role. Unlike the frenzied convulsions of Hollywood depictions, Kwakiutl shamanic trances were deliberate, controlled dissociations. Seated on a mat of woven kelp to anchor their journey to the sea's edge, the shaman would inhale smoke from burning yew branches, their breath syncing with the tide's rhythm. Witnesses described their voices splitting into dual tones, one human, one echoing as if from underwater, as they conversed with Bakwas's envoys. These dialogues followed strict protocols. Never demand, never challenge. Instead, offer compliments. Your feast is abundant, mighty one, before gently steering the conversation toward bargaining. A successful negotiation might involve promising a potlatch in honor of the dead, or exchanging a treasured copper plaque for the release of a specific spirit. Healing ceremonies for Bakwas's victims were equally nuanced. Those who'd encountered him often returned with Cisyutl sickness, a wasting disease marked by visions of twin-headed serpents. Treatment began with the shaman pressing a carved bone tube against the patient's sternum, sucking out invisible rot while spitting into a bowl of seawater. The water would inexplicably darken, filling with flecks resembling rotten wood or flakes of rust, physical proof, they believed, of Bakwas's influence being extracted. Next came the tilakwa, or soul retrieval, where the shaman would mimic Bakwas's lurching gait while holding a carved box, symbolically tricking the ghost king into returning stolen fragments of the patient's spirit. The most profound rituals involved Tamanoa's sacred boards engraved with ancestral maps of the spirit world. Laid across a patient's body, these boards acted as conduits. As the shaman sang, onlookers swore they saw the carvings glow faintly, their patterns rearranging to reveal safe passages through Bakwas's realm. Modern medicine might dismiss this as hallucination, but to the Kwakwakawakw, it was evidence of a deeper truth, that sickness, like hunger, could be a kind of homelessness, a soul lost between worlds, craving the rituals that would guide it home. What sets Kwakiutl shamanism apart is its emphasis on reciprocity over conquest. Where other traditions might banish spirits, the Piaksala sought balance. A shaman who successfully rescued a soul from Bakwas's grasp would later leave offerings at the water's edge, not out of fear, but respect. They understood that the king of ghosts wasn't evil, he was inevitable. The true work wasn't defeating him, but remembering the names, the songs, the stories that kept his hunger at bay. And in that remembering, they forged an unspoken pact. As long as the shamans kept listening, Bakwas would keep the worst of his feasts just beyond the firelight. Bakwas stories were never just about fear. They were moral compasses carved from shadow, guiding the Kwakwakawakw through life's most treacherous currents. At their core, these tales taught that neglecting the dead wasn't merely disrespectful, it was dangerous. Imagine a society where survival depended on communal memory, where ancestors weren't relics but active participants in daily life. When elders warned children about Bakwas luring the forgetful into his rotten feasts, they weren't spinning idle horror, they were instilling a sacred duty. Every unmarked grave, every name left unspoken, was a crack in the world's foundation, an invitation for decay to creep in. Greed emerges as another recurring theme, wrapped in grotesque irony. In one widely told story, a fisherman named Kwalas hoards his catch during a lean winter, refusing to share even with his starving cousins. That night, Bakwas appears at his doorstep, offering a basket of gleaming silver salmon, only for the fish to crumble into maggots the moment Kwalas's fingers close around them. The lesson wasn't subtle. Hoarding twists sustenance into poison, and selfishness isolates you not just from the living, but from the ancestors who ensure nature's bounty. Unlike European fables where greed might lead to earthly ruin, Bakwas's punishments were existential. His victims didn't just lose wealth, they lost their place in the cosmic order, doomed to gnaw on illusions of plenty while their lineage withered behind them. Hubris, too, drew Bakwas's attention. Young men who boasted they could spend a night in his forest never returned the same, if they returned at all. Their tales, recounted in trembling whispers around winter fires, served as object lessons in humility. The Kwakwakawakw lived in a world where storms could erase entire villages in an hour, where the ocean gave and took without warning. Arrogance, the belief that humans controlled rather than negotiated with nature, wasn't just foolish, it was an affront to the balance Bakwas embodied. Surviving his tests required more than courage, it demanded acknowledgement of one's smallness in a vast, animate world. Yet the most profound teachings revolved around reciprocity. Bakwas didn't prey randomly, he targeted those who broke the chain of giving. Potlatches, those grand ceremonies where wealth was distributed, weren't just social events, they were spiritual safeguards. A chief who hosted generously ensured his people wouldn't starve in life or in death. Stories drove this home. In one account, a woman named Tilekwani gives away her last cedar blanket during a famine, only to wake the next morning with her arms full of clams left by unseen hands. The dead remembered generosity, and Bakwas, for all his horror, was oddly fair. He didn't torment those who upheld their duties, only those who let self-interest eclipse tradition. Modern Kwakwakawakw still trace these ethics in their daily lives. When a fisherman tosses the first catch of the season back into the waves, or when parents teach toddlers to leave berries for the birds, they're enacting Bakwas's lessons. Not as superstition, but as lived philosophy, a recognition that survival is collective, that the past must be fed to nourish the future. His stories endure not because they frighten, but because they remind. The thinnest thresholds between life and death, scarcity and plenty, are guarded by the choices we make every day. Deep in the forest clearings where the Kwakwakawakw conducted their most sacred rites, Bakwas wasn't just a cautionary tale, he was an active participant in shaping the next generation. For young initiates, particularly those destined for the Hamatsa society or shamanic training, encounters with the King of Ghosts weren't merely stories. They were orchestrated trials designed to break the illusion of childhood safety. Imagine a boy of 14, blindfolded and led miles from his village at dusk, left alone with nothing but a carved bone whistle to summon help if the terror became unbearable. As darkness swallowed the last traces of firelight, the night would come alive with rustling, not just the wind, but something mimicking human footsteps, then laughter, then wet, ragged breathing. Was it elders wearing Bakwas masks, or had the ritual truly opened a door? The genius of the rite lay in never answering that question. For the Kwakwakawakw, true adulthood began when one could stare into Bakwas's realm without flinching. Shamans in training underwent particularly harrowing ordeals, fasting until their visions blurred the line between worlds. Elders spoke of wrapping initiates in burial shrouds and placing them in cedar boxes, overnight literal coffins, where the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Some reported feeling skeletal fingers brush their cheeks. Others heard feasting sounds just beyond the box's thin walls. The message was unambiguous. To guide souls, you must first walk among them. Only those who emerged singing their ancestors' names, rather than screaming, were deemed ready to wear the Piaxala's otter skin pouch. Girls' initiation rites wove Bakwas's presence more subtly, but no less powerfully. During their first moon cycle, young women were secluded in menstrual huts, spaces believed to be especially porous to the spirit world. Mothers would leave offerings of dried clams and elderberry ink at the hut's threshold, not just for protection, but as bargaining chips. The unspoken lesson: even natural transitions could attract hungry ghosts. One oral tradition tells of a girl who mocked these precautions, only to wake finding her offering basket filled with barnacle-encrusted human teeth. She became a renowned weaver afterward, her patterns always incorporating twisted kelp strands, a permanent reminder of that night's warning. The Hamatsa Society's ceremonies took this further, blurring the line between ritual and supernatural encounter. Initiates disappeared into the wilderness for days, returning possessed by Bakwas, the cannibal spirit. But between the fits of frenzy and foaming mouths, elders whispered that it wasn't just the cannibal they channeled. Bakwas lurked in those trances too. Dancers described feeling their bones hollow out, their stomachs caving in, as if becoming living vessels for the king of ghosts' hunger. The most terrifying moment came during the Namima, or bringing back the initiate, when masked figures would force-feed the youth rotten fish, demanding they chew and swallow. Vomiting meant failure. Keeping it down signaled mastery over the spiritual decay was represented. Perhaps the most profound test occurred in the secret caves near Night Inlet, where adolescents faced the Tilai Kwani, the mirror of hunger. Led to a still pool deep underground, they'd stare into waters black as Bakwas's eyes until their reflections twisted into gaunt, aged versions of themselves. The trick wasn't to look away, but to reach in and clasp that spectral hand, acknowledging mortality's grip without being consumed by it. Those who succeeded earned tattoos resembling water stains on their wrists, marking them as those who'd bargained with the abyss and returned wiser. These rites weren't cruelty disguised as tradition. In a world where famine, drowning, and warfare were constant threats, the Kwakwakawakw understood that survival demanded more than physical strength. It required spiritual resilience. By letting initiates brush against Bakwas's world in controlled circumstances, they armed them against true despair's bite. A warrior who'd endured the coffin ritual wouldn't panic when comrades fell in battle. A shaman who'd tasted rotten feasts could stare into a dying patient's eyes without flinching. Even today, when elders recount these ordeals, their tone carries no nostalgia, only hard-won respect for darkness faced squarely, and the unshakable belief that fear when met with tradition's guidance, could forge unbreakable courage. The forests and coastlines of Kwakwakawakw territory don't just whisper, they speak in a language of eerie phenomena that the people have long interpreted as Bakwas's touch. Take the drifting banks of coastal fog that swallow entire shorelines without warning. To outsiders, it's just weather, but Kwakiutl elders recognize the patterns, how these mists often gather near abandoned village sites, how their tendrils coil like skeletal fingers around cedars where burial boxes once rested. Fishermen tell of hearing disembodied feasting sounds through the haze, the clatter of clamshell plates, and wet, rhythmic chewing. Science might call it acoustic illusion, but tradition knows better. These are the banquets of the drowned, their echoes slipping through when Bakwas's realm brushes too close to our own. Sudden deaths at sea carry his signature too. When a strong swimmer vanishes beneath calm waters or a canoe capsizes without wind, the Kwakwakawakw don't speak of accidents, they speak of invitations. Bakwas is said to herald these tragedies with unnatural sights, schools of fish swimming backward, jellyfish glowing red instead of blue, or the cruelest trick, a floating log that appears just within reach until the victim grasps it, only to find it's not wood at all, but a mass of human hair tangled with barnacles. These weren't random omens, they were a spiritual early warning system. Elders taught children to read the sea's subtle distortions like a language, where every oddity carried meaning. Spot a salmon floating belly up but still alive, that was Bakwas marking territory, a sign to turn home. The forest holds its own terrors. Travelers who have wandered too far sometimes report clearings where the trees grow in perfect circles, their trunks blackened as if by invisible fire. No mushrooms dot these patches, no birds nest in the branches. Kwakiutl guides call them Bakwas's tables, places where the veil between worlds wears thin. Step inside, and the air grows dense, carrying the metallic tang of blood despite no visible source. Modern biologists might blame methane vents or fungal networks, but traditional knowledge offers a darker explanation. These are spillover points where the king of ghosts' influence seeps into our world, where the rules of life and death temporarily fray. Even the behavior of animals signals his presence. Ravens gathering in silent flocks at dusk, their wings rustling like dried kelp, that's Bakwas's sentinels watching. Clamshells found tightly shut despite being freshly dug from hot sand, those are traps set by hungry ghosts. The Kwakwakawakw didn't dismiss these signs as superstition. They treated them as ecological data points, integrating them into survival strategies. A hunter spotting too many deer with milky, pupil-less eyes would abandon the area for weeks, knowing such mutations heralded a stretch of forest where Bakwas's rules overrode nature's. The most chilling phenomena involve sound without source, the infamous ghost tides. Along certain beaches at night, the waves sometimes cease their rhythmic crashing, replaced by what seems like hundreds of whispered conversations just beyond comprehension. Sailors swore these weren't random noises, but coherent words spoken backward or in lost dialects. Kwakiutl shamans interpreted them as petitions, spirits trapped in Bakwas's domain trying to communicate with the living, their voices distorted by the barrier between worlds. The right ritual at the right moment might decipher a warning about incoming storms or polluted fishing grounds, turning terror into tool. What makes these connections profound isn't their fantasy, but their function. By attributing unexplained events to Bakwas's influence, the Kwakwakawakw weren't inventing myths. They were creating a framework to navigate uncertainty. When every odd sound or weather shift carried potential meaning, people stayed alert, respectful, and deeply attuned to their environment. The King of Ghosts wasn't just a story, He was the personification of nature's capriciousness, a reminder that some forces resist explanation but demand acknowledgement. Even today, when a kayaker vanishes without trace off Quadra Island, or hikers hear laughter in empty cedar groves, elders nod knowingly. The rules haven't changed, only our willingness to listen has. At the heart of Kwakiutl communal life, the potlatch ceremony wasn't just a feast, it was a living theater where myths walked among mortals, and Bakwas often took center stage in the most unsettling performances. These elaborate gatherings, spanning days of dancing, gift-giving, and storytelling, served as both social glue and spiritual safeguard. Among the masked dancers whirling to the beat of box drums, Bakwas's presence lurked in the angular movements and hollow-eyed visages that emerged from the shadows. His stories weren't mere entertainment. They were necessary vaccinations against cultural amnesia, injected into the community's memory through vivid performance. When the Hamatsa dancers' initiates possessed by the spirit of supernatural hunger staggered into the firelight, their jaws working wildly at the air, the connection to Bakwas became undeniable. While the Hamatsa embodied uncontrolled consumption, Bakwas represented its aftermath, the eternal starvation of those trapped between worlds. Some ceremonies featured these figures locked in symbolic struggle, their choreography a visceral representation of the balance between appetite and restraint. Witnesses described moments when the Bakwas dancer would extend a shaking hand filled with imaginary rot toward the Hamatsa, who would recoil as if burned, a dramatic lesson about the consequences of unchecked hunger. Storytelling during potlatches often reserved the winter's darkest nights for Bakwas tales, told in a specific cadence mimicking the rhythm of lapping waves. Elders would lower their voices to a whisper when describing his feasts, while children clutched amulets of twisted cedar bark. One particularly chilling account tells of a potlatch where the storyteller paused mid-sentence, only for an unseen voice from the rafters to finish the description of Bakwas's hollow laughter, a staged but effective reminder that these weren't just stories. The tellers knew their craft. By the tale's end, the crackling fire would seem dimmer, the forest outside closer, every listener subtly recalibrating their commitment to tradition. The potlatch also served as a preventative measure against Bakwas's hunger. Lavish gift-giving ceremonies where chiefs distributed blankets, carved boxes, and even canoes were spiritual transactions as much as social ones. By creating debts of gratitude among the living, they wove a safety net of obligation that extended to the dead. A chief's generosity ensured his ancestors would be remembered through the recipient's retellings, starving Bakwas of potential subjects. Some masks carved specifically for these events bore dual faces, Bakwas's hollow visage on one side, a benevolent ancestor on the other, flipped during the dance to show the two possible fates awaiting the neglected dead. Modern revivalists have unearthed even deeper connections. Linguists working with Kwakwala speakers discovered that certain potlatch songs contain coded references to Bakwas's realm. The lyrics might describe ocean currents or forest paths, but the tonal shifts mirror the rising panic of someone realizing they've wandered into ghostly territory. Similarly, the intricate geometric patterns on potlatch robes, long assumed to be purely decorative, form coherent maps when studied closely, charting safe passages through spiritual landscapes where Bakwas holds sway. Perhaps most telling are the accounts from the potlatch ban era 1884–1951, when these ceremonies were outlawed by colonial authorities. In secret midnight gatherings, Kwakwakawakw elders would perform abbreviated shadow potlatches, where Bakwas's role became even more prominent. Without the usual week-long rituals to properly honor the dead, his presence loomed larger, a fact the participants acknowledged by leaving empty spaces in their dance formations, literal gaps where forgotten ancestors might have stood. These risky underground ceremonies distilled the potlatch's essence. By remembering Bakwas, even in whispers, they ensured their culture's heartbeat continued, however faintly. The relationship between Bakwas and the potlatch reveals the ceremony's true genius. It wasn't just celebrating life, but actively defying death's second death, oblivion. Every gift given created a living monument to the giver's lineage. Every story told rebuilt the bridges between worlds. Every masked dancer channeling Bakwas's hollow stare served as both warning and ward, keeping the hunger at bay through the most powerful magic of all remembrance. Along the mist-laden shores of British Columbia, archaeologists have unearthed clues that whisper of Bakwas's enduring grip on the Kwakwakawakw imagination. Among the most striking are the mortuary poles found in abandoned village sites, their surfaces weathered but still bearing faint carvings of skeletal figures offering bowls of what appear to be rotten fish, a motif unmistakably tied to the king of ghosts. Unlike the vibrant totem poles depicting ancestral crests, these funerary markers are deliberately stark, their wood left unpainted to mimic the bleached bones of the drowned. One excavated pole near Alert Bay even revealed a hidden compartment at its base, crammed with broken shell fragments and tiny carved figures with hollowed-out stomachs, perhaps ritual deposits meant to appease Bakwas's hunger for lost souls. Diving deeper into the archaeological record, burial caves tell their own haunting stories. In a secluded grotto on Hansen Island, researchers discovered cedar boxes arranged in concentric circles, each containing not just human remains but bizarre grave goods, clamshells filled with pebbles to simulate food, miniature canoes with holes drilled through their hulls, and masks carved with half-finished faces, all symbolic provisions for spirits trapped in Bakwas's realm. The most chilling find was a child's burial wrapped in a blanket woven from kelp and human hair, its tiny fingers clutching a whalebone figurine with a mouth stretched unnaturally wide. Kwakwakawakw elders identify it instantly. This is Bakwas as the first drowned, a primordial victim whose fate set the pattern for all who followed. Then there are the petroglyphs, those enigmatic rock carvings pecked into coastal boulders. At Yali's Alert Bay, a massive stone bears an image of a spindly figure surrounded by stick-like beings, their hands raised toward what might be a ghostly feast. What's uncanny is how these carvings align with oral histories. One 19th-century account describes a shaman's warning near that very rock. Step on the shadow of the hungry ones at low tide, and you'll hear their teeth clicking beneath your feet. Modern laser scans revealed previously invisible etchings around the main figure's tiny swirls that mirror Kwakwakawakw descriptions of ghost tides, the invisible currents said to carry souls to Bakwas. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from midden heaps, those ancient garbage dumps that reveal daily life. While most contain fish bones and shell fragments, certain strata show abrupt shifts, layers of perfectly edible salmon remains mixed with decayed food, all buried beneath stones carved with Bakwas's sigil, a spiral between two parallel lines. Archaeologist Maxwell Dr. Sarah Hunt theorizes these were ritual deposits, deliberate acts of symbolic decay to feed Bakwas and divert his attention from the living. The timing coincides with known periods of famine, suggesting communities used these offerings as spiritual insurance against starvation's twin horrors, physical hunger and the looming threat of becoming one of Bakwas's withered subjects. Recent underwater discoveries add another dimension. Sonar mapping near the Broughton Archipelago located several canoes deliberately sunk in a perfect circle, their hulls filled with stones carved with skeletal faces. These aren't shipwrecks, they're carefully arranged spirit canoes, matching descriptions of Bakwas' underwater procession routes in Kwakwakawakw oral histories. Divers recovered one such stone in 2018, its surface etched with a map of the coastline, but with certain bays and inlets distorted or missing, as if marking the geography of another world. What makes these artifacts so significant isn't just their age, but their continuity. Contemporary Kwakwakawakw artists like Rand Cook and Corinne Hunt incorporate these ancient symbols into modern works, a carved chest here echoing the mortuary pole's hollow-eyed figures, a glass sculpture there capturing the petroglyph's ghost tides in swirling blues. This isn't mimicry, it's dialogue. Every chisel stroke and brushstroke reaffirms that Bakwas was never just a story. He's the shadow in the cedar's grain, the whisper in the tide pool's ripple, an ever-present reminder etched not just in wood and stone, but in the living pulse of a people's memory. When France Boas first stepped onto Kwakwakawakw territory in the late 19th century, armed with notebooks and an outsider's curiosity, he encountered Bakwas not as a living belief, but as folklore trapped between two worlds. Boas, often called the father of American anthropology, meticulously recorded the king of ghosts myths, transcribing them alongside potlatch ceremonies and mask carvings. His work preserved details that might have otherwise vanished under colonial pressure, the descriptions of Bakwas' skeletal feasts, the ritual precautions against his hunger, even the exact cadence of the chants used to ward him off. But accuracy came with blind spots. Boas's rigid categorization squeezed Bakwas into Western boxes, superstition here, folktale there, missing the visceral reality that for the Kwakwakawakw, these stories weren't archaic relics, but active negotiations with the unseen. Later anthropologists like George Hunt, Boas's mixed heritage collaborator, offered a crucial corrective. Born to a Tlingit mother and raised among the Kwakwakawakw, Hunt didn't just document Bakwas, he understood him as a thread woven into daily life. Where Boas saw symbolic warnings about starvation, Hunt recognized Bakwas as part of a complex spiritual economy, a reminder that forgetting ancestors could unravel the fabric of reality itself. Hunt's field notes reveal nuances Boas overlooked, how specific fishing grounds were avoided not out of fear, but respect for Bakwas' drowned subjects, how certain mosses weren't harvested because their rustling resembled ghostly whispers. These weren't irrational taboos, but pragmatic responses to a world where the supernatural was as tangible as the tide. Yet even well-intentioned scholarship sometimes distorted the myth's depth. Early anthropologists often portrayed Bakwas as a boogeyman, emphasizing his horror while downplaying his role as a cosmic balancing force. Museum dioramas reduced him to a macabre caricature, mask collections displayed without context, severed from the potlatch ceremonies that gave them meaning. The worst offenses came from sensationalist writers who grafted European vampire tropes onto Bakwas, turning him into a blood-drinking ghoul rather than the tragic custodian of the unremembered dead. Such distortions didn't just misrepresent Kwakiutl beliefs, they severed the myth from its ethical core, the idea that neglect, not malice, fuels true horror. Modern anthropology has begun untangling these knots. Scholars like Daisy Seward Smith now emphasize Bakwas' dual nature, his stories as both cultural memory and living law. Contemporary research explores how Bakwas narratives served as ecological teaching tools, encoding sustainable fishing practices by linking overharvesting to spiritual consequences. A rotting salmon in Bakwas's hand wasn't just a scary image. It foreshadowed the literal decay of ecosystems if humans took more than they honored. This shift reveals a truth early anthropologists missed. Bakwas wasn't merely a character in Kwakiutl mythology. He was, and remains, a mirror reflecting the consequences of broken reciprocity, whether with ancestors, nature, or the stories themselves. Still, gaps linger. Many early recordings focused on Bakwas's visual iconography, the masks, the dances, while ignoring the oral dimension. Kwakwakawakw elders describe how certain rhythms could summon or repel him, how the crunch of rotten wood underfoot carried coded messages. These sonic layers, crucial to the myth's power, were rarely notated. Even today, as anthropologists work with Kwakwakawakw communities to preserve intangible heritage, Bakwas's legacy remains a conversation rather than a fossil, an evolving dialogue between those who study the stories and those who live them. The King of Ghosts refuses to be pinned to a page. He lingers in the margins of field notes, whispering that some truths can only be grasped when the fire burns low and the cedars creak with more than wind. Bakwas's emergence into mainstream consciousness hasn't come without distortion, his image often stripped of cultural nuance and repackaged as a generic boogeyman. The most glaring misconception paints him as a straightforward villain, a one-dimensional ghoul haunting the Pacific Northwest's forests. Commercialized Halloween decor reduces him to a skeletal figure draped in tattered robes, lumped alongside zombies and vampires, erasing his role as a tragic custodian of the forgotten dead. Even worse, some paranormal enthusiasts conflate him with the Wendigo, despite their origins reflecting entirely different worldviews. Where the Wendigo embodies cannibalistic frenzy, Bakwas represents the slow erosion of memory. This flattening of his mythos isn't just inaccurate, it severs the story from its roots as a teaching tool about reciprocity and remembrance. Another modern distortion frames Bakwas as a passive relic of primitive superstition. Documentaries often relegate him to voice-over segments about Native American folklore, draining his narrative of ongoing relevance. The truth: Kwakwakawakw artists and elders continue engaging with Bakwas as a living force. When carver Bo Dick created a Bakwas mask with circuit boards embedded in its hollow eyes, he wasn't preserving folklore. He was critiquing how digital distraction fuels modern cultural amnesia. Similarly, contemporary potlatches still reference Bakwas in discussions about environmental degradation, framing clear-cut forests and polluted waters as extensions of his kingdom, real-world consequences of neglecting the sacred balance he symbolizes. Perhaps the most contentious debate swirls around artistic appropriation. Non-indigenous creators have exploited Bakwas's imagery for profit, from tattoo designs slapped on souvenir mugs to video game bosses stripped of cultural context. One infamous example: a Pacific Northwest brewery released a Bakwas Dark Ale featuring a cartoonish skull on the label, marketed as a taste so haunting, it'll cling to your soul. The backlash was swift. Kwakwakawakw leaders pointed out the grotesque irony of commodifying a spirit whose myths warn against greed. These acts aren't just insensitive, they replicate the very neglect Bakwas embodies, divorcing symbols from their ethical moorings. Yet within Kwakwakawakw communities, another subtler tension persists: how strictly to interpret Bakwas's stories in a changing world. Some traditionalists argue his tales must be recounted verbatim, down to the precise cadence elders used. Others, like storyteller Sarah Florence, advocate for adaptive retellings, like framing Bakwas's feasts as metaphors for data mining's erosion of privacy. Both sides agree on the core truth. Bakwas's essence isn't locked in the past, but in how his warnings resonate across generations. The rise of creepypasta culture has further muddied the waters. Online forums brim with fabricated Bakwas encounters teenagers claiming he lured their friends into fog-shrouded woods, complete with photoshopped evidence. While these yarns may seem harmless, they risk diluting the myth's gravity. Authentic Bakwas stories never revel in gore. Their power lies in restraint, the chill of a half-heard whisper, the unease of an empty longhouse where the firelight flickers just wrong. By turning him into another internet monster, these inventions strip away the cultural specificity that makes his lessons vital. What gets lost in these debates is Bakwas's fundamental role as a guardian of collective memory. Whether through commercial kitsch or well-intentioned misreadings, each distortion chips away at the story's depth. Yet there's resilience here too. When Kwakwakawakw Kwakiutl reclaim Bakwas in TikTok skits or street art, they're not just correcting misconceptions, they're reinforcing that his hunger isn't for flesh, but for the unbroken thread of story, ceremony, and responsibility that no outsider can fully consume. Bakwas is more than a figure lurking in the shadows of Kwakwakawakw mythology. He's a living thread stitching together the past and present, the seen and unseen. His stories aren't just ghostly campfire tales. They're a profound dialogue between the living and the dead, a reminder that memory is the truest barrier against oblivion. In a world where cultures grapple with preserving identity amid rapid change, Bakwas stands as a sentinel, his hollow eyes reflecting the cost of neglect and the power of tradition. He's not merely the king of ghosts, he's the keeper of a sacred contract, one that demands we honor those who came before us, lest we join his endless feast of forgetting. What makes Bakwas endure isn't just the chill of his stories, but their depth. He embodies the Kwakwakawakwa's understanding of death as a transition, not an end, a journey that requires the living as guides. His grotesque feasts and skeletal court aren't just horrors, they're metaphors for the fragility of human connection. When parents warn children not to wander near the shore at dusk, they're not just teaching caution, they're reinforcing a worldview where every action ripples into the spirit world. Bakwas's tales are maps, charting the consequences of broken promises and the rewards of reciprocity. Yet his relevance stretches beyond the Kwakwakawakw. In a modern age obsessed with the tangible, Bakwas whispers of the unseen currents that shape our lives. His legends challenge us to ask, what happens to the stories we abandon? The traditions we let fade? He's a mirror held up to every culture's fears of displacement and erasure, a universal symbol of what's lost when we sever ties with our past. Whether through the flicker of a potlatch fire or the pixels of a TikTok video, his presence persists because his questions are timeless. So, as the mist settles over this exploration, consider this. Could Bakwas's hunger be more than myth? Could his feasts of rot and his kingdom of the forgotten hold a darker truth that the boundary between life and death is thinner than we dare admit? Across cultures, ghost stories serve as both warning and comfort, reminding us that the departed linger in the echoes of our words and the rituals we keep. What do you think? Do legends like Bakwas's reveal deeper truths about the unseen, or are they simply shadows cast by the firelight of imagination? Share your thoughts below, because every story, like every spirit, thrives